Oh, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Marcus. I'm a senior customs manager here at Flexport, and we're going to talk a little bit about the tariff landscape today. But if you've been coming to these before, this is a little bit different today. Fortunately, the pace of change on some of the news has decreased. So we're going to do a real deep dive into Drawback with our head of Drawback here today. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. On your screen, you'll see a sidebar on the right of the main stage where you can submit your questions. At the end of the presentation, we host Q&A and answer as many questions as we can in the time. So be sure to get your question in early. In that same sidebar, you also see a tab labeled Docs. This is where you can download a copy of today's slides and find other helpful resources. Above your screen, you have a button to request an ACE analysis from Flexport as well. We will review these in further detail later in the presentation to talk about it, something we always talk about, and we think it's a great free resource for folks. But please click that button if you'd like Flexport to reach out to discuss an ACE analysis for your business. We're also excited to share that this webinar will earn you 1 NEI CCS credit, so please stick around to the end where we'll share the code for accreditation. Okay, and now a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at the current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Joining me later in this presentation will be my colleague, Tim Vorderstrasse, who is the head of Drawback here at Flexport. Knows quite a lot, especially even if you're like me and maybe know a thing or two about customs. Drawback, as we all know, can be a world into itself. So very happy to have Tim here to talk to us about it. All right, so let's take a look here at the agenda here. We're going to go over the latest news. We're going to also then we're going to go into like our main subject today, the duty drawback deep dive, and go over a couple of our helpful resources, and then our Q&A. So with that, we have our latest news, and so here is our latest news that here we go. Here's our latest news that has some of the things that we are watching that have been announced. That in case you missed it, here are some key things to take a look at. So the first one. This has kind of been oscillating a little bit. 200% duty on unknown country of origin for aluminum smelt is effective 6/28. This is Section 232 duty for aluminum. Now, if you've heard this before, it's because after the start of the Ukraine war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a 200% tariff placed on Russian aluminum, but that enforcement has really ramped up. Back in March of this year, they said, okay, if you don't know what the country of smelt is for aluminum, report it as Russia, and then when you do know the actual country, fix it with a PSC. CBP backed off of that about a week later, but now it's back. Now they're saying, starting June 28th, if you don't know the country of smelt of your aluminum products that are subject to 232 duties, you should report the Russian code, pay the 200% duties, and correct it when you have proper information that shows it isn't actually Russian smelter pour. So very important to get your mill certificates in order if you haven't had this before. Many products actually have that as a requirement, but some of the derivative products have not had that as a requirement. Getting these mill certificates together is very strongly recommended. There's a CSMS that is linked in the slide, and it's listed there if you want to read more into it. Second big announcement here is the UK trade deal. The UK seems to be the first country to get a trade deal under the new Trump administration to try to get not free trade but fair trade, as they like to say. Some of the details, the headlines here is that there's a 10% baseline tariff. That reciprocal 10% is staying intact on UK origin goods. Same with 10% for 232 on auto parts. That is also a benefit. Instead of a 25%, UK origin pays 10% on auto parts. There's a quota system established for completed automobiles, so you can still get your Rolls-Royce on lower tariffs. At least not my Rolls-Royce. I don't have one yet, but you can still get someone's Rolls-Royce for less. The next thing I also see here is that 232 duties is probably also going to get further preference as well. So the 50% on aluminum and steel that happened back in early June, that's down to 25% for British origin products. And they also said in the announcement from the White House ongoing 232 investigations will also receive preference as well. So things like chemicals, things like lumber, things like copper products, those would also see some sort of preference lower than the all-country 25% 232 rates. So we kind of look into this as a possible template for what future deals would be. If this is the first one, it seems like maybe this is just sort of table stakes. And I think what is an important takeaway, that 10% minimum tariff seems to be sticky. Most countries, even those with free trade agreements now, are still at that 10% level. The only exception are some products that are qualified for USMCA. They would then be exempted from everything. They could still get the true duty-free treatment. But even for our free trade agreement partners, 10% does seem to be that new minimum for everything from everyone. So that's an important thing to note. We're also in the middle of the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act review, which is a free trade program right now. It has to be reauthorized every few years, and there's a current trade deadline, or a current deadline for July 16th for comments. This is interesting because usually these are a bit more routine. This has been in place for about 20 years. Now the question is this still routine? Is this still going to be a nice, easy thing to be agreed upon in Congress? Is this going to be part of some trade bill, perhaps in the summer? Who knows? So it's an interesting thing to watch here, especially if you do import from some of these Caribbean Basin countries. Think Jamaica, think Dominican Republic, Antigua, any of those countries that are more of those Pacific or Caribbean island countries are usually in CPERA. There's also a Section 301 review on Nicaragua over forced labor concerns as well. Nicaragua is a beneficiary country of a couple of these free trade programs, and so that status would also be under review. We're about 7 months in. This kicked off in December of 2024 with the Biden administration, actually, for Section 301. Remember, Section 301, that was the original Chinese tariffs, that extra 25% back in 2018. That is also now underway for Nicaragua. They're deciding what to do. They have a few more months to decide what they're going to do. But that is another thing that is ongoing right now if you want to make comments. Another one here, we have the 232 derivatives expanded to include more appliances, things like stoves, freezer, refrigerator, combo units, and the steel and aluminum that are made up of, or that create those refrigerators or those appliances. That would be subject to the now higher 50% rate as well. Remember, all these 232 lists that are on there included language saying, over time, we're going to review these HTS codes, see if any more product would be included. So these 232 investigations are ongoing. We'll continue to add new products over time. And so we saw our first expansion back on June 13th. A second note is I got to go to a trade day at my local port, my local port CBP, and they had announced a couple of things. One is that they had completed twice the amount of audits in May versus the year before, and that they're actually hiring more auditors, which I think just is maybe something we've all felt, but here's a real statistic that they want to do much more trade compliance enforcement, duty collection. This is something very important to them. But at the same time, they also, Congress just approved Rodney Scott, who is the now commissioner of CBP, who the main objections from the Democrats were that he has no trade experience. He has border protection. He's part of the BP of CBP, but not part of the C. He doesn't really understand the customs side of things. Interesting to see how he continues to kind of lead the agency, and conduct both sides of that dual mandate that CBP has. Two things that I'm really excited for in this environment, and I'm sure Tim is probably as well. There's a scheduled release for electronic payments and refunds by September 30th, which means no more paper checks for refunds coming back from CBP. And also they want to announce that starting in July, they're hoping to have PSCs able to file and pay duties via ACH on that post-summary correction. So the current process right today is you ask your broker, file a PSC. If you owe money, then you have to wait for customs to send you the bill, or you send it through, or you do a 7501A process, all of which involves the interest calculation, not fun, checks, FedEx slips, expensive. They are hoping to be able to do this via pay.gov instead, starting in July for that release, which would be incredible for both of us if that goes through. Okay. I wanted to bring back this slide here. I did this in the last webinar if you've been watching, just because we are starting to come up against some of these July and August deadlines, and maybe there's a kind of a lean into the freight question. Well, when should my goods be moving in order to beat some of these deadlines here? The 90-day pause on all non-China reciprocal duties is July 8. The EU negotiation deadline has been set as July 9. August 12 is for China for their 90-day pause. So the way we kind of approach it is like, well, why don't we just build in a little bit of buffer? Let's allow some time for your supplier to be a day late and for the loading to happen the next day or something. How do we make sure we try to beat those tariffs? If it's coming in, via ocean from someplace Southeast Asia, you probably need to bring it in by air freight starting today and make these bookings this week. Ocean, you're probably too late in order for that to arrive. We're also getting too late now for EU shipping. If we're looking at kind of a classic EU to US lane, you're probably too late to load by. You probably need to start looking at air freight as well if you're not sure what's going to happen with those 50% tariffs on the EU. Are they going to go into effect? Are they not? If you're trying to hedge your bets, this is also probably a time to maybe look at a little bit more expensive air freight to save potentially 50% reciprocal duties. The final one here is for China. If you're looking to try to get these to arrive by around August 12, 4 days before they go into effect, you still have time to book by ocean probably. If you start to look toward booking around July 8 or before, you should be okay probably. But again, this is just general guidance only. The ocean team made me swear that I wouldn't present anything other than that. This is just rough guidance to know that, okay, if you do want to get to the US before these tariffs go into effect, which is at a high level is roughly the timeline that matters. That is, you have a couple of weeks yet to do so. That's July 8th. Okay. Other developments to watch. This isn't quite the same like massive headline news here, but I've gotten a question or two in the last few weeks that said, hey, Marcus, thanks for the news here, but there's a lot of news right now. What are some of the things that you're kind of keeping a pulse check on? What are some of the things you want to hear about that you're kind of looking for when you look in the trade news? Well, I'm watching the court cases. And so I'm seeing that court case one here. There was an attempt to get an emergency petition by the two importers in that case to have the Supreme Court review IEEPA tariffs, if it's even allowed at all. They would not expedite that review. So they're going to be kind of in a slower process. There is a second case on this, which is a CIT decision. Looks like that has been set for the on-bank review, which is the entire circuit. I'm going to be reviewing it in one go, and there's oral arguments scheduled for July 31st, which is still a little bit faster than they usually move, but it may mean there's not actually going to be any changes or effects for some months yet. Second thing is I'm watching the big beautiful bill. There's been some trade questions in here, notably about de minimis. The House version wanted to end de minimis by January 1st, 2027. The Senate version made no change to de minimis, and now even the big beautiful bill's future is maybe a little bit uncertain as well, as some conservatives want to pull the bill's language a little bit more to the right. Some of the more moderates on the Republican side want to pull the bill maybe a little bit back to the left. So there's still quite a bit of horse trading that's probably going on for that, and no word yet on exactly where we may see de minimis landing. If you're the optimist, there has seemed to be some positive indications on some trade deals with what was called by Bessinet 18 important trading partners, and continuing that 90-day pause for any of those countries that are negotiating in good faith, whatever that means. So what this does mean is that probably many of our heavy exporters to the U.S., our main trading partners, they may still get to see this 10% pause here. But this is this is just the rumor, right? This is what the Commerce Secretary is saying. That may not be what the president thinks, or negotiations can sometimes break down with this administration. So there is positive indication that extensions will be given, which is, I think, is overall, like in philosophy, it's a good news to know that maybe this 90-day deadline isn't as hard for some countries as for others. The question is, okay, well, which countries? They haven't really said which ones. There are a couple that have been kind of floated here. If you watch the news, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Cambodia, Thailand, Canada, all seemingly have positive signs coming out, whether it's from the administration, whether it's coming from the delegations from those countries. All of them are kind of saying the right things, which is good. EU and China is a little bit more mixed. So that one, I think I'm not quite as certain on. It's maybe not quite so positive. But if there's a common thread between these sorts of investigations, they're really looking at origin and transshipping fraud, really to kind of counter China. There's also some free trade uncertainty. AGOA, the Haiti Hope Act, those renewals come up 9/30. CBERA, I already mentioned. And GSP still maybe is kind of in the mix. It's at least being talked about. Senator Crapo from Indiana mentioned that was a thing that may still come up. Or I'm sorry, Idaho, not Indiana. That may be something that comes up, but still not there. Two kind of lurking skeletons that I'm very nervous about are some announcements that were made that were never enforced. One was the secondary tariffs on Venezuelan oil countries that import Venezuelan oil. There was supposed to be a 25% tariff there. It was announced in March, never went into effect, but I'm still watching that. Also on April 9th, there was an announcement saying, hey, we're going to put HMF on rail mode of transport shipments and truck mode of transport shipments because we're not collecting harbor maintenance fee HMF on those modes of transportation. That was announced by the White House, never actually went into effect. But could be soon. So that's something that I look to watch. And then I'm also watching some of the programming changes from CBP. Entry summary rejections for out of sequence tariff codes. This is a quality of life improvement for customs brokers everywhere, which is great. We're also seeing more support for 16 tariff codes. Said they're going to do 32 in a few months. And then we finally just sort of have the every 6 month July 1st HTS updates. I checked this morning. I didn't see if we have a list of what some of those are. They're mostly statistical. They don't really have a major duty impact, but maybe your old HTS code is expiring on June 30th and you have to change the last 2 digits starting July 1st. That's what I look for. Okay, that is the full updates on the news here. So let me turn this over to my colleague here, Tim Vorderstrasse. He's our head of Drawback. And he's going to go into a little bit more detail with us here. Hey, Tim.
Hey, thanks, Marcus. Yeah, excited to be on stage again with Flexport talking about Drawback. We're not going to do a Drawback 101. We're not going to get into the basics. We're going to dive a little bit deeper. There's going to be some assumptions, and I will try to cover some of the basics. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is more so strategies that you can employ, things that you should know, especially given today's tariff climate. And so with that, we'll kind of dive in just to define what Drawback is. And what Drawback is simply, and there's a formal definition, there's been a lot of different definitions. This is a simple definition. Duty drawback is the refund of up to 99% of certain import duties, taxes, and fees upon exportation or destruction. So there's 2 parts, right? There's the import, there's the export, and then there's drawback. And so if you're importing something, you're likely paying tariffs. If you're importing something today, you're likely paying more tariffs than you did last year. And if you are importing something, in a couple of weeks, hopefully not, but you could also be paying more tariffs at that point as well. So if you're paying duties and then you export that merchandise, drawback may be available to you. And so similarly as exportation, if you import something, you pay the duties and you destroy, so remove from the commerce of the United States merchandise through a process of destruction. And this would have to be done by a disinterested third party. So you can't have a bonfire and call it a destruction operation. Has to be somebody like a waste management or clean harbors or somebody who really does remove and destroy waste and can certify to those facts. But if you're importing something and you're destroying, similarly, you can qualify for drawback. And so there's a lot of different ways that drawback works. At the end of the day, there's 27 different types of drawback or provision codes in ACE that you actually transmit to customs. There's some additional variations as it relates to manufacturing and things like that. And there's combinations of provisions. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to there's something that's been imported, something that's been exported or destroyed, and then the vehicle being drawback to then release or unlock those refunds for you. Traditionally, most drawback is filed through what's known as a drawback program with established privileges. However, there is also the opportunity where if you know you're going to be exporting something or destroying something and it's really more of a one-off thing, you can give prior notice through a customs form 7553 to the nearest port of that exportation or destruction, give them about 2 weeks notice, and then you can go ahead and, depending on the decision by the customs officer at that nearest port, either export or destroy with their witness, or independent of them, collect the documents and then file a drawback claim. We're not really going to talk about that because it's a very lengthy process and it doesn't happen as often. Most drawback is filed through, as I said, an application process. And this application process is one that gives you 3 benefits. One is the one-time waiver. That is essentially the waiver for that requirement to have filed or coordinated with customs that 753 going back 5 years for exports and or destructions. So that sounds really good, right? So you start a drawback program, you're like, I have never done these 753s. Do I have drawback even on the table for any of my destructions, any of my exports? And the answer is yes, if you have the documentation. So you can go back 5 years on your drawback, on those exports and claim drawback. And then there's the waiver of prior notice, which is basically the same thing, but instead it's from the date of the approval of the application. It's any subsequent exports from that point forward. You will retain the right to claim drawback, assuming it follows the same proof of concept as what you've applied for, as those exports have occurred or destructions. And a lot of this presentation, I'm going to use exports, but consider exports and destructions interchangeable. That was one of the big things with the new regulations I felt very passionate about, was making sure that throughout the entire regulations, when it talked about exports or benefits to exports, it also afforded the same opportunities and rights to destruction. So if I use just exports, I am likely meaning both. And then the third thing was probably everybody's favorite thing, and that is accelerated payment. The accelerated payment is the biggest differentiator outside of the ability to claim at mass, at scale across all of your exports and destructions, is really the biggest difference between a one-time claim and a privileged claim. The accelerated payment allows you to get paid within 4 to 6 weeks. Without it, just by contrast, you'd be waiting until the liquidation of the drawback claim, which a drawback claim is an aggregation of many, many imports, many, many exports typically. And you would have to wait for the liquidation of all underlying imports, so all imports on that claim. And then ultimately the drawback claim may liquidate if it also has been properly validated and vetted and all that stuff, right? So that could take, by law, right? We know liquidation is 314 days, let's call it a year, and can be extended up to 3 times, so up to 4 years. So you could be waiting without the benefit of accelerated payment. You could be waiting 4 years for that drawback refund. That is a long time to be sitting on capital, right? Especially in today's climate. You're paying so much in duties. There's so many demands on your business. You can't wait 4 years for a drawback check or any cash, I would imagine. So accelerated payment is a great privilege. The one thing I do want to call out is that to get accelerated payment, customs is paying prior to validating your claim, but prior to auditing and doing their due diligence and ensuring that it is compliant, that you have followed all the rules, and that you can support the claim that you're making. And so what you need as a claimant, which, you're an importer when you import, but you're a claimant when you claim drawback. As a claimant, you need a bond, just like you do on your import side, but it's a different activity type. So I get asked a lot, I have a bond on my import side. It's X dollars. Can I just use that? It's like, it's kind of similar, but it's very different in the sense that it's dollar for dollar coverage. If we file a $1,000 claim, we need $1,000 bond. If we have $1,001, we need $1,001 bond. So it really, the bond is just an insurance policy, literally, to ensure that customs will be able to get their money back, whether normally normally things don't go wrong, and customs is able to be made whole, or the claim is compliant and there's no ifs, ands, or buts, and things progress swimmingly. However, in the event that, let's say, your company goes under, which God forbid, right? But then customs would have a protection in place because they've already given you the money and they need to get that money back. And so the surety, the insurance company, would be on the hook for that money. So that's sort of the application process. It is something that you do one time during the life cycle of your drawback program. Unless there is a change to the types of drawback that you're pursuing. If there is a material change to any of the facts, you might modify your privileges, you might amend them to include additional provisions, you might make changes to reflect updates to your business, but largely it's a one-time thing. I also want to call out, for certain types of drawback, you don't need the one-time waiver. You don't need the waiver of prior notice. That's for manufacturing. That's for petroleum-specific drawback. You only need the accelerated payment. And you don't really need it, but again, you need it because otherwise you're going to wait 1 to 4 years, and nobody wants to do that. So for manufacturing and petroleum, you can bypass the one-time waiver, the waiver of prior notice. Just worry about the accelerated payment, and you're good. So these applications are not overly complex. They just involve some information about you, your company, and then we really t-shirt size your program to customs, whether we're looking at we're expecting 500,000, 5 million, 50 million. We're trying to understand what financial obligation customs is going to have as it relates to your program. Then also from a workload management perspective, are we talking about like 10 export transactions, 100, 1,000, 100,000 more? So they start getting an idea of what they're about to get into with your program. And then there's going to be, certifications like I won't commit fraud and I'll retain records. The important things that if you're transacting customs business, about, but they want you to be doubly aware of that, right? You're going to be on your best behavior. Drawback is, as customs reminds us very heavily, is a privilege. It is not a right. You have to qualify for it. So once that application is prepared, we combine that with a document narrative. We show them an example, a proof of concept of how your imports and how your exports match together, the documentation that will be and can be made available to customs in the event of a desk review. And then we tie it all together and tell them the story about how your documents work and how your business correlates or corresponds to the requirements or obligations under the regulations. Then we package it up, we'll send it off to customs, and then drawback is filed in 5 centers, and not each one of them follows a similar timeline or acts with the same amount of urgency or even has the same level of expertise. However, and I really want to call that out because these are average timelines depending on the most of the ports. There are some that I'm not going to call out here that are a little bit slower, and then there are some that are a little bit faster. But essentially, once that application is filed, it's safe to assume at a high level conceptually that you're going to be waiting 4 to 6 months. By regulation, customs has 90 days to review and approve those applications, and it's been many years since they were even close to that. There was a period of time late last year where they were pretty on it, but that has gone away again. And so expect 4 to 6 months. But then pivoting away from the application, if you're doing manufacturing, right, we haven't really talked about you yet. So if you're doing manufacturing, there's really, you start with like an additional step before the application, before the accelerated payment, right? We don't need the one-time waiver. We don't need the waiver of prior notice, but we have to apply for what's known as a manufacturing drawback ruling. It's very similar in concept to, let's say, a binding ruling that you would get on a classification or an origin or something like that. But it is more specific to your manufacturing operation. And there's really 2 types I'm simplifying, but there's a general manufacturing ruling that's basically like a prefab, like a fabricated houses. That's a, hey, if you fit this, or if you fall within these particular parameters, you can take advantage of this prefab or the general manufacturing drawback ruling. But if you kind of fall outside of that, or it's a little bit more in depth, then you're going to have to go the specific manufacturing route. It's important to know in the sense that the timelines are drastically different. The general manufacturing ruling is really a notice of intent, or an intent to operate under the general manufacturing drawback ruling. So most of the form is boilerplate outside of just information about your finished goods, your raw materials, and some, in certain cases, some of the manufacturing specifics or formulations. However, that general ruling, even though it's 90% boilerplate, still goes through an unnecessary amount of time to be reviewed, but it's only another 4 to 6 months, right? That's about the average processing time, whether it's a combination application for drawback privileges, or if it's a general manufacturing drawback ruling, and that's also going to the drawback port, the drawback center. If you fall outside of the scope of the general manufacturing ruling, expect that to nearly triple in timeline. We're looking at 10, 12, I'm hearing rumbles of 15 to 18 months for certain customers. And the problem with that is it also goes to Office of Regulations rulings, which is why it takes so long. The issue with manufacturing is you can't apply for accelerated payment until your initial, until your first ruling is approved. Because you have to have import documents and export documents and bills of material and an approval letter that you have for your rulings as you apply for accelerated payment. So when you think about, it's not that bad if I wait 4 to 6 months for the ruling to be approved, but then you're going to wait another 4 to 6 months for the accelerated application by customs as well. And so then if you think about the specific manufacturing drawback ruling being in that 10 to 12 or more months, you could start to see timelines are getting extended. Unfortunately, as where we stand today, there's not a lot of relief on the horizon. I just want to call out, but if there is some flexibility in certain cases in what constitutes a general versus a specific, and so sometimes there are ways to streamline the process, but usually it's pretty clear, and you're going to have to go specific, or maybe general will work. So the application process generally is a one-time thing regardless, but I do want to call out for general or manufacturing, you need to do that for each manufacturing flow, each groups of products that are going through. You can't apply for manufacturing as a concept, like I manufacture, so prove me for drawback. You're going to have to get more product specific. I'm not going to really get into that all of here, because I will take up all of the time just talking about this. Then the fun part starts on phase 2. So phase 1 was the applications. Phase 2 is data and claims. And when you start off a drawback program, right, we can go back 5 years. How many companies had drawback as their intention in 2020, 2021, when you were just trying to get stuff here, right? There were supply chain challenges. And so documentation and data were not necessarily the priority. But then 5 years later, now you're going to want to get those documents, get at that data for both everything coming into the US and for everything going out, either through exportation or destruction. If you are manufacturing, also getting bills of material, getting the right information needed there, and we start preparing and filing claims. The claims, as I said before, right, that is where the matching happens. The exports either directly or indirectly matching back to your imports, and then the calculation of the duties, the taxes, and fees that are then to be reclaimed. So once you're application is approved, let's say you're an approved drawback claimant with US Customs, your claims will automatically get paid within 4 to 6 weeks. Some of that mechanism to do that will likely change or is scheduled to change in September and then again in November. But as it stands right now, those are physical checks unless you have ACH set up. But if your application is still pending formal approval, you can file drawback claims even if those applications are still pending. However, you won't get paid until the applications are approved. Now, if your ruling is approved and your accelerated payment is still pending, but your claim liquidates, which doesn't happen often, but it can, you will get that money. Even pending the accelerated payment, because you have all the privileges, you have everything set up. I just want to call that out. And the last thing is, when you are a first-time claimant with US Customs for drawback, your first claim will receive a desk review. So the desk review is basically a mini audit. So there's a limited desk review, there's a full desk review. It's largely interchangeable in the sense that it really is the same content. It's just, is it across 7 imports and exports, or it can be up to 30, right? And so at the end of the day, what Customs is doing is, all right, we gave you the privileges, we're giving you accelerated payment, you said you could do this, now let's kick the tires and make sure that you have your documents, you have you're able to support, and the documents support the claim that you are making. And then phase 3, this is where everybody wants to get to, right? After that first claim is filed, you get that desk review, you respond within 30 days, you submit it back to Customs, and they go through their review process, which now there's finally a notification in ACE that tells us whether or not they've approved it. That's when we start setting up a regular ongoing cadence, right? Drawback, we can go back 5 years, but then you're not going to stop importing and exporting oftentimes. And so what we'll do is set up a regular cadence, whether it's annually for smaller programs, semi-annually for medium-sized, or quarterly, or even more frequent for some of the larger programs. We'll set that ongoing cadence of collecting the data and preparing, filing claims, and receiving those refunds. And that's where we really want to get to. And after that, it really is, you don't really get a desk reviews unless there's a reason to be targeted for it, or unless you happen to get unlucky. And so I think I've belabored that point quite a bit. Drawback is a very timely subject, and why I'm here really is because duty rates are changing. We look at 2015, and the duty rates were like just 10 years ago, which 2015 feels like it was yesterday to me, but 2015 was 10 years ago, and 4.7% was the average effective duty rate. Fast forward to 2020, we were at 8.88%. Looking at 2025 year to date, that jumped up to almost 12.5% effective duty rate. Now, that is across everything, right? Some businesses are hit significantly harder, and some businesses are impacted less. But 12.5, it really does tell a very powerful story. And then similarly, if we look at just the first 4 months of every single year over the last couple of years, you can see 2025 at $46 billion in duties paid. I mean, that is as much as I think 2015, 2016, 2017, all those earlier years. And we've only done that in the first 4 months of this year. It is truly remarkable in the amount of duties being paid.
Well, then, Tim, I guess the question has to be then is like, which ones can we get back, right? Oh, wait, you got it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So that's a great question, right? Not every tariff can be recovered. So by statute, by regulation, standard duties or duties attached at the time of importation are claimable through drawback unless explicitly through some directive excluded from drawback. So anti-dumping, countervailing, for example, have always been off the table from drawback. 301 duties, we were fortunate. We were able to get drawback on those. 232s, we were not as fortunate. We could not get drawback on that. Now, there's question right now in the industry of, does a presidential proclamation have the authority? Does a president have the authority to preclude drawback from 232s or even, some of these other ones? And so I do believe 232s in particular could be one that is challenged. We'll see if that day comes, but at this point, drawback is not eligible for any 232 duties. The IEPA fentanyl, whether they were here for a day and a half or 2 days, or they're here to stay, those are not eligible for drawback either. The IEPA reciprocal, whatever you want to call it, those are eligible, right? That baseline for all the countries, those are eligible, which is really good for most companies, because if you're importing, you're probably paying this one. Also, the Section 201, which really is solar panels and washing machines, I think primarily, those are also eligible for drawback. But yeah, unfortunately, the 232s, I think that one hurts a lot for a lot of businesses, because steel manufacturing, you got to get your steel from somewhere, and there's only a limited supply here in the U.S. So it's certainly something that I do think is going to get challenged at some point. All right, so what I want to talk about kind of in the remaining time is about strategies to maximize your refund potential. And there, I'm breaking out 5 different strategies, and I know I am running against the clock. So I'm going to go kind of quickly here. Is you want to be intentionally entry construction. It could really have an impact for certain types of drawback. Reassess your accounting methods. We saw right in that chart, companies are paying more duties now than they ever have before. And so if you're using a low to high blanket, you are likely missing out on significant refunds from not pivoting to something that targets, or at least gives you the opportunity to claim on time-based drawback accounting methods, something like a LIFO or a FIFO, or even a low to high with an average inventory turnover period. And we'll dive into that in some of the subsequent slides. I probably don't have time to go through all of it. Control your consumer returns. This is a big one. This is a huge topic over the last year and a half. And it has been for a while, but it's escalated because customs has changed their interpretation and are now really enforcing it. Top to bottom, and you want to make sure that if you are accepting returns of used items or tried on items, you are keeping that inventory separate from anything within your inventory that you intend to fulfill export orders from. And clarify your classifications, right? You own your classifications. How you classify your merchandise, make sure it's as specific as possible, because it can have significant impact. It has significant impacts on the duty that you pay, but also could have impacts on the types of drawback that are eligible for the products that you're importing and exporting. And regularly look for opportunities. And so this is, look at the purchases that you make domestically. What is their country of origin? Is your vendor importing the merchandise? Are your customers exporting your merchandise? Are you importing packaging materials? Are you incorporating that into your process? Sometimes it's a little bit more niche than that. Than just import and export. You want to look across your supply chain, look at your vendors, look at your customers, and the things that are, surround your product. I know we're at time, so I'm going to just, you have these slides. Essentially, this slide shows you that from an entry construction perspective, if you're grouping entry lines, so the same item has the same HTS, the same country of origin, a broker may put it all in one entry. You could import and export the same exact SKUs, the same exact CI even, and you could only claim back, in this example, 16.7%, or 83.3%, and you lose out on 16.7%. The rest of these are in the slides. If there are questions, I'm happy to talk through them. I know we are way over. One thing I do want to talk about is looking for opportunities, right? Let's look under the couch cushions. Look at your third parties. Review your destruction. If you have donations, where are they going? Are they staying within the US, or are they going to a foreign country? Warranties and recalls. Are you taking them back? Are you destroying them, right? Look at your packaging material. Look at alternate provisions. Have you always been doing it one way since 2015, 2012? Maybe it's time to revisit. Am I doing the best? Am I utilizing the best provision at all? And then finally, look at contract manufacturers and program optimization. There are ways you can maybe not impact the drawback amount, but by optimizing your processes, your data, you can increase and bolster the profitability of your drawback program. With that, I'll turn it back to Marcus.
Yeah, well, one question here, Tim. I'm seeing on this slide,
Yep.
it's saying like, I think something I've heard before is just like people that say like, well, I don't import and export. I only sell to, domestic parties. Like I don't know where the export is. I don't know what they do with it. Like, people say like, well, I'm not actually eligible for drawback because I don't actually, export. I don't destroy it. It's all just kind of moving around the U.S. once it's here. But what you're saying from this slide is that we actually can do that. Is you actually can claim it. Maybe there's just a little bit more legwork to kind of find some of this stuff, but you're saying it is possible, even if you're saying, well, you shouldn't end the conversation with, well, I only sell to the U.S. Right? You're saying that the conversation maybe could keep going from that point. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one interesting example was a auto parts manufacturer that sells to like AutoZone, or Midas. I go to Midas in my town, and there's certain shelf life for certain products, and they have the expectation that 10% is going to be destroyed, and so they build that into their pricing. Well, they could, that's being destroyed with the right coordination, the right process. 10% of all of your inventory is a significant amount that is potentially being destroyed. So it is something that, as you kind of look at everything across your supply chain and your sales distribution channels, there might be more under the couch cushions than you realize. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I think we got off to a little bit of a slow start here, but we will make time for the Q&A here, at least for just maybe a couple of quick questions. And so one quick note, we do have a few things here. We offer our ACE analysis, and that's still a button you can click here at the top. It just takes a quick setup procedure. If you're already using ACE, you're already set. It won't take more than half an hour. If you're not using ACE, you have to get set up. This is where all your trade data lives. All the official data that's being declared under your importer record number lives in ACE. We have a great tool that can give you some very clear insights from it very quickly and into your hands. So please reach out to either customsbd@flexport.com for that information. Next, we also have just a couple of classification supports here. And I think for Tim, isn't it just drawback@flexport.com? Is that the place for anybody
Customs
interested
BD.
in drawback?
Yeah, Customs BD at Flexport is the best way to get a hold of us, yes. Okay,
well, great. Excellent. Well, yeah, let's take a quick look at some of these questions here. So let's see. We got a first one here. I believe we can declare country of smelt unknown, but is that the same as a 200% as country of smelt Russia? Yes, that is correct. That is what was changed from that recent update. Yeah, so it'd be, if it's unknown, it would be treated as Russia and the Russian code to be used. Is it also your understanding that for sections 232 tariffs now applies equally to all HGS codes in 76 and 73, as well as those derivatives outside? Yes, that was a change that happened July 4th. So this means that if that's kind of the silver lining of going to 50%, is you can now break out the steel and non-steel portion, the aluminum and the non-aluminum portion, and only pay the 50% on the steel portion, only pay the 50% on the aluminum portion. That used to be allowed for things outside of Chapter 73 and 76, but yes, it is now allowed for things that are also within Chapter 73 and 76. I will say our current understanding is that only applies from June 4th forward. It doesn't apply for things, going back to like March, that like March to June gap. If you can't go back on a PSC and split it out. At least that's our current understanding. We'll have to watch for more updates there to see if that's the case. Let's see. Can you clarify Trump's post that China's at 55% tariffs? Yes, this is a thing here. The math that is working out is there's 10% all country reciprocal, 20% For China, IEPA specifically related to the fentanyl case, that makes 30%. And then the last 25% is being assumed from the Section 301 list that affected a lot of products, although not every product. So that 55% is maybe a little bit lower for some things that maybe weren't on those lists, maybe things like toys, or that were on list 4A at 7.5%. So that would be 37.5. Things like clothing, some footwear only would have the 4A 7.5% list. Let's see here. We got a question for Drawback here, Tim. Can the Drawback bond be a single entry bond or is it a continuous bond?
That's a great question. My preference is for single transaction bonds. They're more effective. They're easier to get access to. And quite honestly, because of how long things take to liquidate, if you put it on a continuous bond, that liability just continues to stack. If you do single transaction bonds and that one claim liquidates, that liability goes away, and it makes it easier in the future to get single transaction, more bond coverage. That being said, also one thing on bonds is it's good to diversify sureties. Some sureties are great at handling both, but some are great at a lot of other things. So it is good to diversify.
Okay. I got another Drawback one here for you as well, and maybe a chance to put on your salesman hat. Is Drawback heavily like kind of do it yourself to the company, or does Flexport help us hand in hand? Maybe can you talk about what are some of the things that, if you're a Drawback client with Flexport, what are some of the things that we can do and some of the things that we can't do that the importer or the Drawback claimant would have to do instead?
Yeah. So Drawback is notorious, unfortunately, in the industry as being or I guess one of the bad reps about Drawback in general is that it can be a lot of work. And so since I joined Flexport over 5 years ago, the plan has the mission of what we've been doing is trying to make Drawback a consequence of your import and export activity. And so if you're doing your imports and your exports with Flexport, Drawback should be the logical consequence of that partnership rather than an undertaking. That being said, we know the reality is a lot of our companies or a lot of our clients don't do either full imports or any imports or exports with Flexport. And so we have a process around, making introductions to brokers. Give us access to your broker, and we'll get the necessary information and the documentation. Getting access to ACE as a broker, especially now with how MPF needs to be calculated, is extremely important. It's critical as a Drawback practitioner in ensuring that we are doing our due diligence and making sure we're compliant and that we're not leaving anything on the table. And then when it comes to exports and all of that, right, there are ways to streamline the process. There are no regulatory requirements for X, Y, and Z data to be provided to customs today. There will be in the future, but right now there aren't. And so there are some process oriented changes that can be made to realize some efficiencies and reduce some of the burdens. But Flexport will take on a lot of the work, either because we have technology and there's a lot of AI Drawback startups that have come up in the last couple of years. There are use cases for Drawback, and we utilize them for document digitization and things like that. But then there are use cases that are not really Drawback eligible or don't really apply as much for AI. So we use technology where it's reasonable to help streamline the process. And our goal here, and before I joined Flexport, there used to be, somebody staffed up on both sides, the client side and our side. And so far at my time at Flexport, we've signed a lot of great companies and nobody's had to staff up to help support their Drawback offering. So we do take on a lot of the work, and that definitely shows.
Yeah. Okay, I do see one here. I know we're really over time, but I see somebody from asking about de minimis that I have to hit on. So somebody's saying the House bill is going to take away de minimis. Is that the case? We still are not sure. And de minimis, I should clarify, they're asking about de minimis for China. That is gone. That is gone as of May 2nd. So if you have Chinese origin product or Hong Kong origin, Macau origin product, you haven't been able to claim de minimis since May 2nd. Every other country of origin is still allowed to claim de minimis. Those are still in place. Those are still allowed if you have something else. If you have India, Pakistan, Indonesia, those you can still claim de minimis on. However, in the House bill, by law, they would be taking away de minimis. The advantage and kind of the politicking behind the scenes there was, why would they take away de minimis? That can sort of be treated as a revenue producer, which can sometimes offset costs. There's rules in place in Congress where any new spending has to be offset by reductions in spending or increases in revenue. The idea is to try to like keep a balanced budget. The House version uses de minimis seemingly in that way to try to say that we're going to raise revenue by ending de minimis for every country, so that way they can take credit for it if they want to try to increase spending in other places like they wanted to do in the military or in CBP and DHS. So that was a good question there for that. I believe the EU 50% reciprocal tariff was only threatened, not the official rate. 20% would be the official rate. Yes, shout out to somebody who wants to keep me technically correct. Yes, technically right now it says 20% is the EU specific rate. That is paused in place of the 10% rate. But yes, the threats coming out of the White House have said 50%. If you want me to kind of peel back and opine a little bit more, the reason I think 50% is being thrown around comes down from Section 338. Check out our recording from 2 weeks ago when I went through the tariff toolbox to hear about why I think maybe 50% could be on tap for the EU. So yes, technically correct, 20% for the EU. Thanks for keeping me honest there. All right, I think with that, we're gonna have to get off the air here. But thank you very much for your time, everybody. That concludes today's webinar. We'll be sending out the slides and a link to the recording tomorrow. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of your day.